My name is Mac. I'm in a band called Superchunk. We're from Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and we're playing a show here tonight. We started the band in 1989. Actually, the bass player Laura and I started the band. Chuck, who the band was named after when we were just called Chunk originally, is the drummer, Chuck Garrison. A guy named Jack McCAUGHAN was a guitar player. About a year later, Jim Wilbur, who's the other guitar player now, joined the band. I knew him from some friends at school. I went to school in New York, and he was at school in Connecticut. John Worcester, who was our drummer, joined in 1991. It's been the same lineup ever since then. And I think the key to staying together this long was a couple things. One is that we've always been in control of our music and our art. We put our records on a label that Laura and I own. I think that helps a lot. A lot of bands sign to major labels, and when they get dropped, they're totally in debt, and they don't have someone to put out their records, and they're seen as a little bit like as a pariah to the rest of the industry, even if they're a really good band. And so I think that's why a lot of bands break up, and we've never had to go through that. We tour a little bit less than we used to. We put out records only once every 2 years now instead of once a year. Slowing down the whole cycle, I think, just gives you a little time to breathe in between what you're doing. We've always been from Chapel Hill. People sometimes ask us, why haven't you moved to New York, or why are you still in a small town? It's much easier to be in a band in a small town than it is in a big city, because it's expensive to live in a place like New York, and if you're in a band, you're not making a lot of money. Chapel Hill's a college town, and it's got a good network of things that keep it musically active. There's a good radio station, a couple of them, WXYC at Carolina and WXDU at Duke University, are both really good places to hear new music. And then you can come to a place like the Cat's Cradle, which has been around, basically like 20 years. This is where I came to see bands when I was in high school. If you're living in a town that is fairly inexpensive to live in, you can go see good bands. You've got friends here. Why would we move? Laura and I started Merge in 1989, and at the time we were just putting out 7-inch singles and cassettes, and it's grown over the years, obviously, and now there's a bunch of bands signed to Merge, and we put out probably between 10 and 15 full-length CDs a year. There's about 5 other people who work there. So when we go on tour, the label keeps going. There's a woman who's playing with Superchunk on this tour named Annie Hayden. She's playing with us tonight. We put out a record of hers earlier this year. If you listen to Lamb Chop and Spoon and Superchunk and Third Eye Foundation, or name any other bands on the label, the Magnetic Fields, it doesn't all sound the same, and I think that's one of the reasons that the label's been successful. Independent music, when we first started, it wasn't big business, and it wasn't acknowledged by big business, meaning major record labels. Even though Superchunk doesn't sound like Minor Threat, and Pavement doesn't sound like Black Flag or something, I think that there's still like, at the time, in the late 80s, I think there was still a similar feeling of like an underground kind of feeling. People in bands like Sebadoh and Superchunk, we grew up listening to punk rock. We've tried to retain a little bit of that spirit, or as much as possible, actually, even as our music has sort of gotten a little bit more diverse, a little bit more dynamic. When Nirvana got popular, and that's sort of when all of a sudden every band was getting signed, and then what you ended up with was basically like a bunch of watered down versions of good bands that were selling lots of records. And there's still a lot of small labels putting out good music. I think that it is still possible for kids to get that feeling of like, oh, this is this special band that only my friends and I know about, and people get really excited about bands like that. And I think Belle and Sebastian is a good example of that. Even though they're huge, they're still perceived as being sort of this outsider group of musicians. That feeling still exists, and maybe just not as easy to sort of like find as it was 15 years ago.